Conservation Act up. For those of you who've been involved with this, and you would know it took almost 15 years for the Act to finally come about. The Federal EPBC Act came out long before, in fact, the state one did. The federal ones are different from Western Australia, in fact that they're only listed as threatened ecological communities under the EPBC Act. They have an FPEL list, which is the Federal Priority Assessment. Oh, I've lost it. Anyway, it's the ones that are proposed to be made, and they do have standing. The current one that's probably of most interest to WA would be the Tuart woodlands of the Swan Coastal Plain, which are recommended to be critically endangered. Anybody can nominate. That will change with our legislation, and the scale of these is usually large. To be some other differences are there must be a significant impact on the community to be referred. Any impact on TECs in Western Australia has to be referred. There's an emphasis on offsets, and in fact there's no staff in Western Australia, and I must admit a minor gripe that there is no resources really to give, but the onus is on local regional places to actually operate these. So as I said, the federal scale tends to be at a much larger scale. We're talking about the sub-regions or IBRA regions. So, for example, one of the examples of this, of course, is the wheatbelt woodlands, which occupies a whole bioregion and part of another bioregion. So they are very large scale. They tend to be, if you want to think of it, the sort of beard level, much greater than the beard level systems. They're actually above the vegetation system, which means that they are somewhere between what the IUCN does and what perhaps the state does. And that's a map of them. You'll notice there's a fair concentration, just about all of southeastern Australia is a threatened ecological community. There was very little in Western Australia until the NRM process started. And because the federal government largely funded NRM groups and NHT groups based on matters of national environmental significance, it did mean that all of those small state-listed ones that WA looked like it didn't have a case of the measles compared to Eastern Australia. So there has been a considerable emphasis from many NGO groups, not from the state government, to get a whole lot of these put on. And the main driver for this has been the Humane Society, believe it or not. They've had a Pew grant, those dreadful overseas people, which have enabled them to hire some consultants to actually put up the Tuart woodlands, the South Coast Kongan, and the Eucalypt woodlands. We were enabled by our CEO to assist them in this process, but it is true that the state has not tried to get many communities up at a federal level for quite a while. So this map will definitely change. The Tuart woodlands will go on it, and there are proposals for more communities to be put on the FPEL list for the wheat belt. Just one example of where we do get together with the Commonwealth, we both co-occur. We do have a number of the communities that are on our state list, which were accepted on the federal list under the EPBC Act. This is Lake Richmond, here down near Rockingham, and it has two federally listed communities on it. It has the sedgelands on Holocene swales and dunes, and of course the thrombolites. And the thrombolites are an example of a microbial community, as I'll point out that in fact you can have microbes to mammals as a community. The thrombolites are effectively living rocks. They were quite tricky to work out what exactly defined a thrombolite, but fortunately new DNA techniques have enabled us to actually characterise the microbes that are within those and to actually constitute them as an ecological community. The Muchet limestones, which are probably an example of a series of what we call a series of ecological communities occurring in the same soil type, are also listed both state and federally. And these are an example of a very poorly known community until they were mapped. This is Ostrostipa jacobsii, a new species from the Bunbury area, and this is still an unnamed species of Melaleuca, allied to Melaleuca cystina, which forms almost the dominant across the area at Kemerton. So these are examples of things where much smaller communities, as well as the very large ones, are both state and federally listed. What happens in WA? Like I said, they can be microbes to mammals. Bat communities in mangroves are one there, thrombolites, stromatolites there. There is one key aspect that they have to be mappable. They have to be mappable so you can actually notify landowners and people who've got these that they're actually on their property and they can be defined. So that's a key point of our threatened communities, that they can't be the microbes on the whale's tail because they move. In 2019, all of these, as Ken has talked about, will actually go through the Threatened Ecological Communities Scientific Advisory Committee. So we'll be working through all the 69 that are currently listed to make sure that they've actually, although we've done it before, they have to actually go back through again. They'll also, will be listing them mainly under the IUCN criteria Ken talked about, so that they'll actually be set through the IUCN criteria, and that's why they all have to come back. One big difference between WA and the Commonwealth is we have priority communities, as well as the TECs. So 2019 there'll be legal listing of the TECs, and in 2019 also, as Ken probably also pointed out, the community will be able to nominate TECs to the Scientific Advisory Committee for our CEO. We report to the Minister via our CEO, so we're a ministerial committee. That is probably a big change, that the community will be able to nominate communities. What do we have? We have also, one of the differences between the Commonwealth and the state is we do have what we currently call presumed totally destroyed. And I'm not sure, I don't think the Commonwealth has that. We also like them, but critically endangered and vulnerable. And we have the priority ones, priority 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. Priority 1 and 2 are generally probably under threat. 3 is under threat, but in lots of occurrences, only some of which are. That's conservation dependent, and that one means that it's, as long as we keep doing what we do, they should be fine. So we have 69 are currently endorsed by the Minister, even though there's no legal standing. They do have standing under the EPBC, and they have standing under the Environmental Protection Authority. So 31 of those are listed under the EPBC Act. Of the 69, 21 are critically endangered. That means they're likely to go extinct in the wild within the next 10 to 20 years unless the threatening processes are somehow stopped. 17 are endangered, 28 are vulnerable, 3 are presumed extinct, and we have the odd 1 or 2 poorly known ones. So there's 391 PECs on the list. And I think in that we actually even beat the Flora in terms of percentage of communities that are listed. So we get those PECs from all sorts of places. We get them from reports that consultants do. We get them from, like, the land system mapping the Agriculture Department's done. We've got a whole series of those because they put threat categories onto those land systems. So we've got a whole series of those done for the area outside the southwest. They're our best estimate of getting some sort of idea of what a threatened community is outside the southwest, because they've actually done the mapping right across the state. It's digitally available, unlike the beard mapping. It tends to actually say it's a particular soil type, it's a particular landform, and we can then get more information about it to see whether the guesstimates about how endangered it is or otherwise are correct. A couple of the totally destroyed ones, not surprisingly, one's the Brenner Flats vegetation system, the other is the Irwin vegetation system. And the third one's a wetland in here that's totally flooded since they cleared the area. Why they're considered presumed totally destroyed is the fact that we cannot work out how to recreate them. These are two vegetation maps for the area. There's John Beard's map for the Granite Flats, showing it's a forest. Here's another guesstimate from a PhD student who looked at it and found that it had things like tree savanna, but there are so few species actually given in this that you could never recreate what the community is. We did have thoughts of doing this, but the cost is just, it's better to keep something that's not extinct than to try to recreate something that is. And there's a lesson in that for people working on mammoths. Okay, the wheat now for the federal ones compared to WA. The wheat belt woodlands, EPBC is critically endangered, versus in Western Australia we listed as threatened in some places, some communities, some parts of it under stress. It's just too big and too ill-defined. Not meaning anything against the EPBC listing, but for Western Australia it's considered to be too large and too ill-defined to be actually placed on a ministerial endorsed list. We know that WA, and there's probably more than this, but Judith Harvey and I went through the wheatbelt woodlands. We know there's at least 55 types of wheatbelt woodlands, really different types. And this is just one of them that's a TEC. These are gimlet trees, but they're the lowland gimlet community. They don't occur on breakaways, they occur on flats around salt lakes. They've just about entirely been cleared or lost to salinity. This is a stand at Cherry Tree Pool, which was mapped as salmon gum, and it's one of the only decent remaining examples of this community. So that to us is a TEC, a critically endangered TEC at a state level compared to the federal level. Of course, the other one that's coming up that you all know about, which is now in, of course, are the Banksia woodlands of the Swan Coastal Plain. This has considerable impacts on development and other areas. EPBC listed as endangered versus WA again as P3. Some areas are under considerable threat and may disappear, but it is quite a widespread community, and we just can't list this under our current means as a threatened community. And this, of course, is at Mount Masua, where it turns into a convent, speaking of issues of mapping. What are some of the features that mean we've got problems with the Banksia woodlands? And the Commonwealth has these as well, because WA is unlike that other two-thirds of the boring part of Australia. It's got really major issues. It has a low tree diversity, so it wouldn't be much good saying this was a Banksia woodland over something or other. 15 common species throughout the range of hundreds of kilometres, large numbers of understory species, 616 species in 233 sites in the floristic community, those floristic community types. High species diversity per site, 30 to 90 species per 100 square metres. Very high beta diversity, changes across adaphic and geographic areas. Very few taxa are in more than 75% of the sites. Only 30% of them, or 40%, are in 10 or more of those sites. Rarely recorded taxa are incredibly common, 45% at 3 sites or less. 30% of the taxa have ecotypic variants, which means they've got very distinct wetland or upland or north-south variants. And the flora of the woodlands here is highly endemic to Western Australia. 86% of the species in it are only found in Western Australia. That has meant that we have a series of our own listings of Banksia woodlands. Central one is endangered. This one I'm going to the Supreme Court about is the FC20A, which is critically endangered in WA and regarded as endangered for the EPBC. The first time, however, the EPBC has agreed that areas that are of greater significance in Western Australia will be regarded as greater significance for the EPBC actions. And that is the first time that's ever occurred, because federal legislation obviously overrides state. So they've agreed that these ones that we think are much more threatened will actually be treated as much more threatened under the federal system. Further information, there's a lot of stuff in the under our, in the D4 section for species and communities. And there's also a lot more information with the federal government under their website as well. And just one plug, everybody hates committees. More committees they all know. I'd just like to point out that the state TSAC per meeting costs about 10 cup lunches and about 20 cups of coffee. So I think we do a pretty fair job, and I'd like to commend the people in Species and Communities branch who support us in this work, and just thank you and tell you that the juggernaut of communities is heading your way.
Are there any questions for Greg?
Hello. I often find it difficult to find maps of PCs. You said that one of the criteria was that it has to be mappable. Unless we actually do the BDCA paid database search, yeah, I find it difficult to find maps.
It is an issue. We do have maps of many of the communities, but where they're on private land, of course, obviously they can't be made publicly available. That is one issue. The second issue is we don't have decent maps of many of the bigger ones, the EPBC listed ones. I put up numerous proposals for funding to sort this out with, including up to the Premier, and we have not quite got there yet. Although I suspect that when these things are made legally binding or have statutory, that may change, that we may actually get some of the resources and able to do this. So the short answer is yes, we do have some maps. The long answer is no, we don't have some maps. And the longer answer is, like everything else, hopefully it'll come soon.
Greg, you mentioned that 20A, for the first time, is going to be acknowledged by DOE as having a higher importance than just the Banksia woodlands. Is that not the case for all of the state-listed TECs and PECs? Because they do say that they have elevated standing if they are also recognised at a state level?
Most of the ones in the past have been entirely within the EPBC Act and the State Act. It's only now that we're getting these much bigger areas incorporated that's become an issue, because federal legislation overrides state legislation. So they have a requirement that it has to be a significant impact on the threatened community. And it is a fact that you could clear all of 20A and not have a significant impact on the Banksia woodland TEC. So it's a operational system, but it is a formal system for doing this, and it's it's going to be interesting to see how it transfers across to things like the wheat belt woodlands, which we think has got a whole lot of those similar sorts of issues. But it is great that even though the state and the federal government probably won't get to the same place with communities because of their different scale and different outlooks, that in fact we may do the same level of protection for some of these because of just literally getting a memorandum of understanding or interest between the people to do it. And that's the main aim, is to keep these communities going into the future from both of us. I hope that answers it.
Hi Greg. Just wanted to ask, you mentioned about in 2019 the plan was to start trying to roll over some of the state TCs into IUCN assessment. Has there been some thought about where you would start? Which communities, I guess, are higher up on the list?
Yeah, that's probably the easiest ones, I'd have to say. I would guess things like the Muche limestones would be easily, yeah. I would assume we all start in the smaller and easier ones that are actually you can do the threat analysis and stuff simply. I guess that's the obvious answer that you do, and we would hope that some of the analyses that are running currently on some of these things, Conrad, may actually aid us in this by the time we get around to some of the more complex ones.
I agree. For the Banksia TEC assessment, Ted and I did a pattern analysis. Your sites, his sites, my sites, and so Banksia woodlands from the Swampastle Plain up into the Zula Sand Plains to Dandarian Plateau. And we knocked that into a significant number of groups. I can't remember exactly, but a large number. And so this cuts back to the issue of the broadness of the 94 FCTs. And it's really time, I think, that you've got a new classification for the Banksia woodlands so you can define things better.
Well, in fact, Conrad's literally PhD will be addressing some of those issues. We've just provided him with the data sets, and there's no doubt that as you go north of the Moore River, the floristics of the Banksia woodlands and on the Darring Plateau really do change. So, yeah, I'm sure it will change, and we would certainly look forward to obtaining any good quality plot-based data that you do have on Banksia woodlands to, I'm sure Conrad would like to see it as well, because it will definitely aid. The more the merrier. It will not make things easier, but it will make them better.
Greg, we've already done an analysis.
No, Malcolm, it's true, but we have got a processing scale to try and do this. But these things can't just be, because they are going to be statutory things, they have to go through quite a detailed process that we hope that the information is published for.
I'm sure of that, and I know about Conrad's process, and I've given him some data. I've actually helped him set up his database, so I know about it, but that could take 2 or 3 years. And I think we need to do it more urgently. And I had the data all in a database, I had it largely corrected, and I offered to work with you, Paul, to be on it and reject it.
Well, no, that's actually not true. The process is not simple. Doing stuff in a statutory manner is a bit like naming a plant species. You can put an informal name around something, but actually taking it right through to publication is quite a different process. The same goes for threatened plant communities. That you have to do a whole lot of things that you are rate limited, and they have to be signed off by the ministers, they have to be signed off by our CEOs, and they have to be, to a degree, go through a process, and there is no easy way to do that process rapidly unless you get a lot more resources, and that's the simple answer.
Is there a standard way of determining FCTs, and how much of it is open to interpretation?
It does depend an awful lot where you cut the dendrogram, obviously. That's one of the things that is open to interpretation. You can, as Malcolm would like, to cut the dendrogram lower, so you get smaller groups. There are methods of analysis where you can check whether those things are realistic. So, and they should be done to make sure that what you're getting is biologically meaningful and actually is a real result. There are lots of issues, as you've heard during this conference, about data quality, about getting enough sites, because these are species-rich sites that vary a lot, and there's a lot of noise in the data set. So yeah, it is an issue. Don't know if you're going to ever get a standard operating procedure for this one.
Maybe as an extension to that, Greg, when we have TCs formally listed and projected under the Biodiversity Conservation Act,
How do you imagine tackling the community descriptions in a way that are then robust and applicable and clear, such